How are you doing?
Hey, there he is. Look at Dan. Dan, did you travel this weekend? It seems like most weekends you travel.
No, I was actually cornering this weekend. I was down in London at Bellator with Terry Brazier. So as soon as his fight was over, I was back on the motorway, back home to watch the UFC card. So I've consumed pretty much everything that there's been, but I wasn't at a UFC event this weekend, unfortunately.
Look, can we start with the Bellator main event? Did you see that?
Sure. Yeah.
All right, so what are your thoughts on Lovato? By the way, again, look, I'm going to get as many predictions wrong as I got right, but I just had a sense, just knowing who he was from jiu-jitsu and watching him in Bellator previously, great finisher with jiu-jitsu, athletic, can wrestle. You just knew this was going to be a problem. Mousasi's amazing, and it was very close. Your sense about how Lovato did and why he won?
He worked to his strengths. I think that was ultimately it, and Gegard was never able to get ahead of him. The thing is with Gegard Mousasi, sometimes he shows up and he looks like a world beater, and other times he shows up and he just doesn't seem to be able to get out of third gear. And I think that some of that is down to him and the way that he shows up, and I think some of it is down to how his opponents show up for the fights. Lovato's a very, very interesting and dangerous guy. The way he fights, he's got a lot of experience in the grappling range. I just feel like he was able to work to his strengths more. He was able to get out of the gates faster, and I feel like Gegard was never able to really get started.
How much of that not getting started can we credit to Lovato, though? Always getting after it in the second round, fifth round, and maybe the first or the third, always going for takedowns within 15 seconds of the beginning of the round. I get your point. It's well documented. Everything you're saying is true. On some level, though, I feel like Lovato deserves some credit to stifle him.
Oh yeah, 100%, 100%. I just feel like Gegard just didn't look himself, and Lovato showed up on the night. I feel like those two guys can battle back and forth. I feel like they'd be as interesting training partners as they are opponents, to be honest, with the way that their games interact with each other. I'm sure that Gegard's going to look back on that and see lots of ways in which he could have found his way into the fight and been able to better Lovato, but it just wasn't his night. I feel like they're quite evenly matched on their best days.
So where would you put Lovato top 10? Where would you put him? I mean, I guess you have to kind of put him top 10 at this point. Where would you put him, roughly, give or take?
It's hard to say because I feel like we kind of lost Mousasi in the UFC rankings right at that time when he was starting to really find his groove. Right after he beat Uriah Hall in Manchester, and he started. He was trash talking at the press conference. It's the first time we'd seen that version of him. And then I think, the controversy around the Weidman fight was a real setback for him. And after that point, he stepped out of the rankings. So I don't really know where he is now. I don't really know what drives him, because before he left the UFC, what was driving him was to be the best in the world. And, and I'm not saying this in any way because I'm a UFC, I work for the UFC, but if you want to be the best in the world at the moment, you still got to be in the UFC. That's why it's difficult to compare, because we kind of don't know. It's not that we don't know where Mousasi is. We knew where he was. We just don't know where he is now, and it's hard to compare where Lovato is. Definitely top 10 though. And I think with the style of fighting that he's got, he's an interesting antagonist to a lot of the guys in the division right now. Someone I'd love to see him face someone like Jacare. Can you imagine that? That'd be a real tussle. It's just difficult to compare because the rankings are separated. I'm all for crossover fights, and I'm sure that a lot of people would be surprised in me saying that. But like we saw the Horiguchi fight the other week in Bellator, I'm a big fan of that. I want to see these guys be tested, and I want to see the promotions invest in their champions. I mean, ultimately, like if you think back to what's the movie Troy, when they call upon the champion of the army to fight instead of the whole army fighting. I mean, that's kind of the way I like to see it. So I'd like to see those champions cross over and face each other. And I hope that one day we can get to that stage.
One more question about this, sort of as a general overview, which is, you look at a fight like this and you say to yourself, okay, clearly you have to be well-rounded, because if you didn't have the striking skills of Lovato, which were a step down from Mousasi, I think we can all agree to that, you'd be in trouble. And if you didn't have some kind of wrestling, you'd be in trouble. And if you didn't do strength and conditioning at a high, really pinpoint level, you'd be in trouble. At the same time, though, it seems like that jiu-jitsu level ace in the hole, it's still valuable in modern MMA. I feel like we tried to get a homogenized all things be good. Maybe being a jack of all trades is not as good as being the one who can do some of those things and still has that one little edge. What do you make about specialization in modern MMA?
Well, I think I think what we're seeing right now is a reinforcement of what we learned in the very, very early UFCs. We learned that that jiu-jitsu, ground fighting skills are the dominant style of fighting in most scenarios, because most fights move fast enough, they're chaotic enough for guys to close through striking range and end up in some kind of clinch or grappling range at some stage in the fight. And obviously, if I'm building a fighter from my perspective, I'm starting with the ground up. To be honest, I'm starting at a young age with the ground skills, and then you kind of bolt everything onto that. Because once you've got the confidence on the ground, that's almost like a fighter's foundation. And with someone like Lovato or Damian Maia is a good example, someone that's got such a strong foundation on the ground, anything that they build upon on that foundation is going to be much stronger. Which is why you see, a strong wrestler like Tyron Woodley excelling so well in the striking range, because he knows he's got that in his back pocket. And the difference where, from my version, from my journey in the sport, is that I came from the top end. It was almost like I was building the roof before I built the foundation, is kind of how I see it in hindsight. So as a striker, I'm starting with the stuff that's floating around at the top. And then I was playing catch up during my career, trying to fill in the space underneath, which is, clinch work, takedown defense, submission defense, and then attack at the bottom. I built the wrong way around, in a grander picture. So I think that specialization at the moment, all is proving to us is that jiu-jitsu is the strongest foundation you can have in the sport. My argument then would be that wrestling is the strongest foundation, because then you can dictate the ranges. But for me, MMA is not about dictating ranges, it's about finishing people. And I think if you've got a strong specialization in grappling and striking, the wrestling's much of a muchness, because you can exploit at the other ends of the spectrum where your opponent's weak.
Let's talk about the UFC card. Korean Zombie is back, just absolutely obliterating Moicano. I actually want to talk about Moicano in a second. I made this point on Twitter the night of the fight. If you were around in the sport when he was fighting Dustin Poirier back in Fairfax, Virginia, he was like the original Justin Gaethje to an extent, something like that, where Dana White was wearing his shirts. He was known as Mr. All Action, and yet world class, still very good. I think the casual fan, Dan, kind of forgot about it. Not the hardcore fan, but the casual fan. Wow, what a reminder that was on Saturday night. What is your take on how he did?
I was just so impressed with his timing, with his composure. And the thing is as well, that something that we've seen very little of throughout his career is what it means to him. When he got up on the fence afterwards, you could see the emotion, you could see how much it means to him, and that for me shows a lot, because that means he's going to carry that into his next fight. I think he's a very exciting individual, and I was at American Top Team, a week or so ago, watching Moicano prepare, and I mean, that just adds credibility to the victory to me. Moicano looks very, very impressive. He was sharp. He was able to maintain range with every one of his opponents very well. He was able to establish their timing very well, and that was something that immediately was apparent against Zombie. He just didn't see him moving. It was almost like he didn't believe he was attacking him with such confidence at such speed.
Here's a question that I don't know sometimes I say I don't know the answer because I'm just being nice to a guest, but no, I'm being dead serious, Dan. I'm really looking for some help. I'm lost on this one. Other than when it's obvious to everybody, when do you throw in the towel on a prospect? And here's what I mean. Moicano's obviously very good. He's beaten good fighters. But I think the UFC, every time they bump him up that next level, whether it's Aldo, whether it's Brian Ortega, whether it's Zombie, they keep trying to see if he can get that level. And he so far he hasn't. He's age 30. Now, Sage Northcutt is much younger. Aaron Pico, even younger than that. They're in different stages. But that's sort of my point. At what point can you say, this guy's going to make it, this guy's not? Because I don't know the answer. What do you think?
I don't think there is an answer. I don't know. I think it depends on the individual. I think on a grander picture, I think we focus far too much on the destination in MMA. It's a sporting mentality. We want to see the winner. We want to see the finish line. We want to know who the champion is. And the reality is that there'll always be another champion. There'll always be somebody else. And what we've seen from fighters in this sport is that because we don't bank so much on an undefeated record, because we are more forgiving in MMA, and we do see people rise and fall and then rise again. I mean, like, if I was a boxer, after 2 losses, I'd have been counted out. You knock me out in London and I'm not getting signed for another decent fight. Whereas in MMA, I was back co-main event against Anthony Johnson in my next fight. Although it can seem like a very cruel sport, it is very forgiving. And from a martial arts side, like, it's not about a destination; it's about a journey. Like, at what point would we have hung up the gloves on Michael Bisping if it was up to us? And it would have most definitely been before he won the title for a lot of people. We're looking at that for Cowboy now. I know he's coming off a loss, but I don't think that throws shade on the fact that he's still got a lot of potential to do something big in this sport. I mean, he's already a superstar as it is. I feel like the ebb and the flow is so much more important than the destination. And for Moicano, he's I don't know how old he is off the top of my head, but he's certainly not as old as me, and there's still time for me. So I don't check out on people until they check out on themselves. And Moicano's not that guy.
Fair enough. Moicano's 30, so there's still plenty of time. He's not by any means a finished product either. So, by the way, I asked you this a year ago. You still mulling a return?
You know what? I'm always mulling a return, and I'll get a few days of training together, and then I'll be dragged off somewhere else in the world to talk about somebody else fighting instead of myself. I did spend a week at American Top Team, though, doing some filming with Amanda Nunes and a few other the fighters there. And every time I'm around Conan Silveira, I always start feeling like I'm starting a training camp. He's got that talk. He's got that, hey, when you come in, when are you going to move in? We've got a room for you in the ATT dorms. We've got this coach to work with and that coach to work with. And, I'm there watching these fighters prepare and daydream. And then I'll come home and I'll hit the bag for a while, as you might have saw on my Instagram. I'm moving well. I feel good. I'm moving well. I feel like I don't think I'll ever be able to fully retire. There's no point. I want to be able to take my gloves off and leave them in the octagon, especially because I want to come and hang them to the wall hang them on the wall in my gym as well. I don't leave gloves behind. I would love to fight again. I absolutely would. I've got ideas in my head of who I would like to fight and where I would like to fight, but none of that's relevant right now. What I need to do is get myself into a position where my body's moving well over a couple of months. And the USADA testing pool will give me that time. I've just got to jump in instead of dipping my toe in the water every now and then when I see Jeff Nowitzki.
All right, let's talk about the other fight this weekend, the bare knuckle one. I was not one of these guys who was super opposed to it. I thought, I heard that Malignaggi was making stupid money for this fight, like the kind you could not turn down, really not turn down. Huge figure. I don't know what Artem got paid, but hopefully it was a lot as well. And I wasn't against it because I thought it was kind of interesting. It's like a boxer who's been retired for a long time but did really well in boxing versus a UFC fighter who did okay, but had new bare knuckle. MMA translates better to bare knuckle and, was full of just verve to get out there. So that was kind of interesting, right? I'm not sure what I learned. What did you learn?
I learned the same from this recent event as I have done from the previous ones. Is at the moment everyone's fighting bare knuckle like it's not bare knuckle, and that's what I'm seeing throughout the whole sport. And that's why I knew Paulie would struggle, not only because he wasn't a particularly powerful boxer, but because he's got very delicate hands. You take away that padding, and the other thing as well, like the amount of boxers that I know that I've trained with that have damaged their hands, and the amount of martial artists that have punched many people in the skull with 4-ounce gloves on and never hurt themselves. I feel like there's a different condition that comes with even hitting with MMA gloves on. I did probably the first 8 or 10 years of my training with no gloves on at all. Sometimes I'd wrap, sometimes I wouldn't bother. And it builds the structure of the hand to make a fist, like a square block. You look at a boxer's hand in a glove and it's shaped like this. And if Paulie was breaking his hands when he was wearing gloves, he was always going to hurt himself when he wasn't. So how do you keep off someone like Artem? But the thing is, like, as much as we love the way that Artem fights, and we say, that he's maybe representing MMA in some way, he's not. I mean, Artem's a fun guy to watch, and he's a brawler. He's got some good skills, but as far as MMA goes, his journey didn't work out well in MMA. He got to the UFC and he had some good scraps, but he's a brawler, he's a fighter, and that's why we love him. It's not a representation of MMA for me, and it's not about boxing against MMA. It's about two guys that like fighting, that have fighting skills, that have got a problem with each other and they want to test. And the only thing I will say about the bare knuckle boxing thing is that if the first bare knuckle boxing event would have happened at the same time as the first UFC event, they would have evolved together in different paths, obviously, but together. You see, MMA's changed so much since that first event, and bare knuckle boxing, as it is right now, has got loads of people coming from different combat sports and trying to figure out how to fight bare knuckle. And if you go back to the 1900s, early 20th century, if you look at photos of bare knuckle boxers, the way they stand, the way that they fight, the way they throw their punches, I've got loads of old boxing literature in my library. And, you compare the way that those guys stand, and it's far more further back. They use the back of their knuckles all the time, and they're not punching like they've got gloves on, and they're not guarding like they've got gloves on. I would say that's the only reason why MMA guys are maybe coming across a bit better, is because they're used to not having, an extra 3 inches of padding around their hand. But I think bare knuckle boxing will evolve on its own, and I think eventually we're going to get guys that are pure bare knuckle boxers, and I'm excited to see that. I can't hate on somebody else's journey. I love fighting as much as the next guy.
The criticism of bare knuckle boxing has been it just keeps catching people from the other relevant combat sports on their way down. I'm not saying I necessarily endorse it, but that's the common view. Do you share some of those concerns that it's not at this point recruiting, or is this maybe your viewpoint is maybe that's true for now, but if it keeps going, it will get its original entrance?
Yeah, I think so. I look back over the years of the guys that have walked through the doors of our gym, and I would say probably 5% of them would have been much better going down the route of bare knuckle boxing. And I think if they would have specialized in that, they would have developed the sport in a way that would look very different to what it does right now. I have no problem with it, really. I think it's unfortunate that connection's been established, because it is an obvious pathway for guys that are no longer successful in MMA, and because although there's kind of a rough idea of a feeder league that goes up to the UFC. There are certain promotions you can fight to go up. There's nowhere that catches you when you fall from the UFC. So if you still want to continue fighting, there's no way that you can go after the UFC unless you want to go back down onto the lower circuits. But then that's kind of a crapshoot as to where you end up. Whereas if you've been competing at the top level and you've got good exposure, you're being offered decent money to cross over to something different, then I don't understand why people wouldn't. I get it. I absolutely get it. I mean, it's in a different life, in a different dimension, I'd have been a bare knuckle boxer and I would have loved it, and I'd have probably had no teeth. But it is what it is. It's just like you're a big hockey fan. The amount of players that we get coming over to Europe that are coming to the end of their career can't compete at the top level anymore. They come over here and they rough it in Europe because we have some real brawlers over here. I don't see why anybody should have the choice to cut that option off for anybody else. As you said, this transition period where guys that are finding their way out of other combat sports, and that's acting as a safety net for them to make some extra cash. I'm looking forward to that dynamic changing and seeing some proper bare knuckle boxers develop.
Fair enough. All right, what's next for you? When are you back on the road? What projects are you working on?
Oh, what's next? Vegas. I've got Cage Warriors Night of Champions this weekend, this Saturday. I've got 3 fighters on the card on that, and I'll be there doing some TV stuff for them. And then the next morning, I'm flying to Vegas, and I'm in Vegas for the whole of International Fight Week. Not exactly sure what I'm doing on fight night, though. I might be doing some radio commentary somewhere. But yeah, living the best life I can.
All right, very quickly before we let you run, let's do the main event for that UFC card. Jon Jones taking on Thiago Santos. Look, Jon might be the best fighter we've ever seen, all right? So it's hard to say exactly what Thiago Santos can do. But maybe you think there's some ideas. You've seen how he's evolved. You've seen him compete. I made the case for Anthony Smith. Not that I said he was going to win, but if he does, it's going to be under these conditions. What are the conditions under which Thiago Santos can win?
Well, the obvious one, really, he has to be himself. He has to not fall into that Jon Jones voodoo that everyone seems to get caught in. And we saw it so much in his last 2 fights against Smith and Gustafsson. Guys fall into this trap where they never get started. He stifles every attack with just a poke or a prod or a feint. And the danger for Thiago Santos is that if he gets caught in that rhythm, he'll be stuck there for 25 minutes or less, obviously. He needs to create his opportunities. He needs to stay mobile. He needs to give Jon Jones a blank face and not recognize him as the greatest fighter on the planet. He needs to attack him. He needs to damage him. And this was a conversation John and I were having, John Goodman and I, when we were filming Inside the Octagon, which will be up soon. The person that beats Jon Jones technically isn't in the UFC right now. The person that stands in front of Jon Jones and plays kickboxing with him and out-wrestles him and out-grapples him, that person's not in the UFC right now. Because when they come into the UFC, we'll recognize them immediately because they'll be special. So the person that beats John Jones right now could be any of the 4 or 5 guys that are rising through this division, because they're wild, they're reckless, they're powerful, they're as tall as John Jones, they're rangy, they're aggressive, and we've seen them stopping everybody. And we've got, the likes of Rakic and Reyes and who am I forgetting? Johnny Walker. I still put Anthony Smith in that group. I think he's even closer to that now. He's had an experience with John Jones, and he's experienced John Jones from his own defense, which has given him confidence. I think we have a lot of guys in this division right now, obviously Santos being the top of the pile, that could be the hand grenade for John Jones's career. It's not going to be an outclassing over 5 rounds. It's going to be something explosive and nasty that John Jones didn't see coming. And unfortunately, we don't have the technical guy that's going to beat him, I don't think, right now. But we've got a lot of guys that can really throw a wrench in the works. And that's what we're all watching at the moment. Every one of the John Jones's fights is which one of these guys can catch him.
Well, Dan, it's always great to catch up with you. You've been great to me for a very good long time. And always appreciate your analysis, and enjoy Vegas, my friend. You are Hunter S. Thompson's #1 MMA fan, or from MMA anyway. Enjoy.
Thank you, my friend. Always good talking to you. I'll see you soon.